This is a chapter review for Vinland Saga, chapter 201, Thousand Year Voyage, part 10. So, this chapter is an interesting one. This is a very, very short chapter. Last chapter, the preview had everything to do with Thorfinn. It said something about Thorfinn. What is Thorfinn thinking? But this is just another case of don't take the editor's note at the end of a chapter too seriously, because it isn't always very accurate. Now, normally, at the very least, if it mentions a character, you can expect that character to be here. So this is a pretty standout example where Thorfinn was directly mentioned, yet he's not even in this chapter. So what I imagine is one of two things happened. Either Yukimura wasn't sure what this chapter was going to be just yet, and the editor essentially put in a just throwaway note. Like, it's probably safe to assume Thorfinn will be present, so let's make a little note about Thorfinn. And it just didn't pan out, but that's fine. Other case, of course, could just be Yukimura's been very open about having trouble putting this final stretch of chapters together, and just being very concerned about his ability to portray his message. So it may have just simply been that this chapter was originally going to be for Thorfinn, but he opted for something different just because he needed more time, basically, to make sure he perfects what's coming. So, again, I say this pretty much every time there's a shorter chapter or a delay for a month or something like that. I would much rather Yukimura just take his time and we just let the man cook, because I have more faith in him than I think any author I've, I guess, followed in the month-to-month or week-to-week release format. So let him cook. So my chapter predictions from last time pretty much mean nothing. And most of them were bigger picture anyway, so I'm not even going to bother going over my predictions for this chapter, because a lot of stuff we've just been talking about over the past, I guess, series of chapters that I've reviewed. I always forget the one that I started on, but we've been talking about it since then. The idea that the rats are going to be a big problem, and pretty much a lot of discussion and prediction from across all those episodes just kind of comes together here. So yeah, let's just get into it. Chapter 201, Thousand Year Voyage, Part 10. So we start here, and the second I saw the rats, and the fact that, again, this cover page says that this is the explanation of the disaster in Markland, the second I saw the rats, I knew, oh my god, the rats. Yukimura's finally pulling the trigger. So yeah, we have the rats here, and we see Vargar again. I'm really happy about this. I've wanted to see Vargar back pretty much since 190, chapter 190. I just thought he was so interesting in that chapter, and I wanted to keep seeing more of him. So I'm glad that he's still kind of a key player, even though he's a little bit more low-key than most of the main cast. But we see he's found somebody here in Markland. So last time we were here, this was completely deserted, but now we have Vargar here, and they found one survivor alone. So they're asking him what happened to everyone. And this guy, he's like barely conscious. And they give him some food, and Yukimura has a just, I don't know if it's funny or creepy, this panel, but this panel on the bottom left is Yukimura, all right. So they give him some food, and they start trying to get some information out of him. You know, this reminds me of Willibald. This reminds me of Willibald being all crazy until he gets his alcohol. That's what this makes me think of, especially this top left panel. But they talk about how Markland has been deserted since early summer, but now they stop by and he's here. And again, they say the Mu attacked. And this is interesting, right? Because this kind of plays into Thorfinn's initial response to this incident, which was, don't assume that the people here are the same as the people in Markland. Don't assume the Gitpi tribe that we know is the same people. They likely don't even speak the same language. but they call them the Ulnu because that's all they know how to refer to them as, right? So part of it, I think, is again grouping these people together and just kind of having this bias in the back of their heads because of how little information they have on these people. But again, like chapter 192 was all about, that these are not the same people. But as they're starting to get concerned that they need to get out of here because the Ulnu might notice, so the paranoia, of course, they're everything happening, all the tension in the main settlement, and then of course just being the people who are able to see what happened here in Markland, or at least the remains of it, they aren't very trustworthy right now and they want to get out of here. But the survivor says Utko Takan. I hope that's pronounced correctly, but they're confused and they're asking him, what did he say? But he continues, the indigenous people are gone. There is not even one of the indigenous people left in this place. And then we get this insane double spread. Oh my god. When Yukimura gives these double spreads, they always hit for me. I always think of the Canute double spread in the farm arc when he's first brought back and you see all of Mercia burning. This reminds me of that, but was just the horrific and painful imagery of chapter 189 with the shaman's vision. It's just heavy, but so he explains all of the native people in this area are dead. I saw it myself, the Utkotakan. The birds were possessed by the spirits of the dead. Everyone died. And Vargar is put off by this, saying spirits. And this is kind of interesting for Vargar, isn't it? Considering his, I guess, background chapter in 191, where it's all about, you know, how he lived by faith, Norse faith. And then over time, after his interaction with Thorfinn, now he isn't so focused on faith anymore. He isn't so focused on prophecy and divine, I guess, a divine course for the world. He's very much focused now on what can I do to live a satisfying life. So it's not like this contradicts that growth for him, but it's kind of interesting just to think about how spirituality and faith relates to him and how he reacts to this talk about spirits. But more on this moment a bit later. The survivor asks, is Vinland still safe? And they're kind of shaky about it because it's kind of not, but it still is. So they're kind of not getting straight to the point, saying, well, we haven't been back in a while, we don't know what's going on there. I feel like before the 1,000-year voyage arc had started, they would have said, yeah, Vinland's fine, but they're worried. They think, and they see it too, that war is pretty much inevitable. But in response to that, he says, if they're still safe, they should prepare to evacuate while they still can. What happened in Markland will definitely happen in Vinland. We can't coexist with the indigenous people. You must flee Vinland before a war starts. And we see the rats one more time. And again, for Vargar, this is so interesting. His whole, I guess, awakening in chapter 191 that we see, 192, that we see in the flashback to Thorfinn on the boat with him. He was living his life based on what he was told will definitely happen. Ragnarok, the rapture, what have you, these prophecies. And now he's being given a new prophecy. What happened in Markland will definitely happen in Vinland. We can't coexist with the indigenous people. And that's just so interesting to put Vargar in that situation just from what we know about him. But I want to talk a little bit more about Markland. Now that we're done with the chapter, yes, this is the end of the chapter. It's 8 pages. This is probably the shortest chapter, I think. I'm not sure if there was one shorter, but I can't imagine there was one. I think the previous shortest one before this was chapter 10. Despite, though, being 8 pages, this chapter does a lot. It carries a lot of weight in these pages. And with a double page spread like this, I'm fine to wait. Yukimura is top of his class, as he always is. But let's talk about Markland, because chapter 192 review, I gave a lot of ideas of what could have happened in Markland and what the truth was. I thought that maybe the arrows were left as a warning, and I thought that maybe the Markland settlers had left the premises and crashed in some ship accident because their ships were missing. So, what seems to have happened, well, either way, before we get to what I think actually happened based on this new information, the most important observation I made there, and I think everyone made there, is that attack was not an actual attack against the Markland settlers. There was more information that we needed, but based on the evidence of the arrows being left there, no bodies, no blood, nothing being left there, it was clear that the Markland settlers, at the very least, did not die there. They were not killed in an attack. So I thought potentially this was a thing where the native people scared the Markland settlers off, and maybe that would indirectly lead to their deaths, right? And the arrows were just left as a warning to anyone else who comes, because they likely knew that at the very least there would be more people eventually. Maybe not that this was part of a larger group, but that more people would come. But what I miscalculated, and what we learned here, is that it does not seem that warning was to say, don't come in our territory. And I was still convinced, at the very least, that was likely what was going on, that this was a get away, leave us alone. But this chapter, with the rats finally coming into play, which, again, I am shocked that I did not predict, but hindsight's 2020, I guess, but we've been waiting for these rats. I think we all just assumed they were in the main settlement only or something. But actually, we should have known, because a boat was left here, and if a boat is left here, we know from the beginning of sailing west that the rats stay on the boat. That's like a sailor's thing. So they probably destroyed the boat because it was like infected or something, you know? There's so many possibilities, but let me get to my point. I think that the arrows were left in Markland not to say, don't come into our territory, but to say, do not come here or you will get sick. That's what the warning really seems to be now, because we see everybody here has died. All of the native people have died. What is interesting, though, when Vargar had passed by, it must have been pretty recent or something, because if we remember, he got shot with an arrow. At least his boat did. Got shot with an arrow, and he took it as a sign that says, don't land here. What we, again, thought was a defensive, don't land here, don't come near me, it seemed to be a proactive, don't come here or you will get sick. Because the rats brought likely smallpox, and the native people just have never been exposed to that. It would be a plague onto them immediately. I've seen a lot of people say stuff about how this might be the plague or something like the Black Plague, but it's a little too early in history for that one. very likely I've seen a lot of people say it's smallpox. So I will probably assume that. But either way, it's disease. One interesting idea I saw somebody say was the idea that maybe those arrows were scattered around because they were trying to shoot these birds. Because you can see in the double page spread that the birds were possessed by spirits of the dead. Everyone died. Now, this could definitely mean that the birds were carrying disease, and maybe that's how it got from the rats to the native people, besides obviously the rats themselves spreading around over time. But maybe if they were shooting up at these birds, that the arrows would just land on the ground like that. But again, I don't think it makes sense to think that, just considering the fact that they would have probably just fallen dead right there, and you'd probably find a couple bird bodies, at least I would assume they would hit some of them. I think it's an interesting idea, but definitely not a likely one. I'm definitely leaning towards the idea that the arrows were a warning message to preserve life for anybody else who may come by, who might get sick. This also, again, brings into the question that arrow shot at Vargar. Could that have been an arrow shot by a Markland settler? That's possible, considering the fact that they could have been quarantining with the native people. That is a very valid reason why they would have left the Markland settlement. They probably left people one by one, and they kept getting sick, and they didn't know why, and then they would all go to some kind of quarantine. Now, I don't think this disease would impact the settlers as much as the native people. And that is a huge reason why these diseases were able to come here in the first place. The European people have undergone so much time of building up immunity that this disease would not impact them the same way. It would impact the people who have been isolated from Europe for their entire lives and for generations and generations leading up to this. So this exposure would hit them harder. So we still don't have a solid reason why all the Markland settlers are gone. And this Markland settler, the one that we found left, seems to be saying that all the native people are dead. He isn't saying that everybody in Markland is dead, which is very interesting. And a little bit more about him in a few minutes. I first want to talk about, I guess, one more time with the arrows. It is possible, again, with the missing boat, that the native people started getting sick, and not that they, I guess they would see, right, that the Markland settlers aren't getting sick, and take this as the Markland settlers are bringing this onto us, right? And then they would have had some kind of retaliation attack that could have, again, drove the Markland settlers away. Now, I want to check. I don't believe we see the boat here, though. The missing boat. So, that, again, begs the question, where was this guy? And based on what he's saying here, right, the fact that the birds were possessed by the spirits of the dead, that would have come directly from the native people, that assumption. So, again, this implies that he was with them. They weren't just staying in Markland, and they didn't leave Markland out to sea. They went with the native people. And that's, again, why I think they were quarantining. And those arrows, again, were potentially even a collaborative warning from the native people to the rest of the Vinland settlers to not stop here because they might get sick. Because either way, this guy, he's taking it better, obviously, than the native people, since they're all dead in the double-page spread above him. But he is clearly sick, or at the very least, he has not eaten well, or had anything to drink in a long time, right? So, assuming he is sick, though, I would assume that he is the last survivor of everyone. Or, possibly the Markland settlers were just essentially quarantining with the native people, and eventually they were the only ones left, the Markland settlers. So the question would be, why did this guy come back to Markland alone, if the others are alive? My best guess for that was that he came here to give a verbal warning to get everybody out of Vinland, because things have gotten worse. When we saw them earlier, they were probably in the middle of trying to quarantine and isolate this illness. But at this point, everybody there died. So, and they probably noticed that they were taking it at least better. So they sent one person to give a verbal warning to get everybody out of Vinland, because they sent the message, don't come to Markland. They did not send the message, get out of Vinland in general. So that makes it very interesting, though, because now we have two groups saying get out of Vinland. We have Misekbikwe and everybody who has given in to his paranoia. And then we have the Markland settlers who were also trying to send the message, get out of Vinland. It's very interesting that this chapter had the author's note at the beginning, the truth about what happened in Markland, but I feel like I have more questions now than I did before, but in a good way. So one of the things I really want to mention that really stuck out to me, and why I think that the native people did not attack the Markland settlers, is that this guy that we've come across, he uses a word from the native people. Now, I looked this up, and this is Mi'kmaq, which is the language that all the Unnu characters up until this point have been speaking. But, and I know we've talked about how this tribe likely doesn't speak the same language, but assuming they do speak the same language based on what we're seeing here, how would this guy have known this word, right? And that's what makes it seem like they must have been very, very well integrated with these people. At least, maybe not to the extent of Thorfinn and the Gippi tribe, because they had the benefit of having Thorfinn with them to kind of manage their pretty good introduction overall. But it seems that these people have gotten along quite well with the natives around here as well, considering he's using a word from their language. Now, of course, it's likely he just heard this word as well. But what's so interesting, though, when I looked this up, this word meant burial. Of course, there's plenty of possible definitions. I would say Mi'kmaq isn't exactly a language that's going to one-to-one translate to English, since they just do not have the same origin. But either way, this word meant burial, or maybe grave, or something along those lines. So he had to have heard that from somebody, right? Now, somebody would have had to refer to this as the Utkotakan, right? So this makes me think he didn't just stumble upon this, right? Somebody who speaks this language had to have been alive during this process and say this word to him and communicate this idea to him, right? So I think that kind of brings me to my current theory of what happened here, where disease started to spread. The Markland settlers essentially came to quarantine with the native people. Probably over time, they began to catch it, and they didn't want other people in the settlement to catch it, so they sent them to stay with the natives. And then over time, everybody was catching it because they just didn't realize how it came to be and how it got into their food and all of that. So they probably just stayed with them, and then eventually they had to abandon the place altogether. So, as a warning to get maybe even everybody to leave Vinland and not just don't come into Markland, they had the arrows scattered. And with this guy being alive and probably not being a former prisoner, I feel like maybe he would have mentioned that. And the fact that he has this word from them and this idea from them about the birds possessing the spirits of the dead, it screams to me that there was collaboration between the Markland settlers and this group of native people. So that's my theory, locking it in. And I guess that's kind of a next chapter prediction, but I want to go into the real chapter prediction, which is here next time. Meanwhile, Canute, after coming to this conclusion, based on the last chapter, editor's note, where I said, oh, they said Thorfinn would be here, but maybe, it was just a throwaway, never take the editor's note seriously. Now, I get the editor's note immediately, Canute. So, a lot of people have talked about this in the community, just this understanding that you shouldn't take the editor's note too seriously. The most recent example, which I talked about in the video where I reviewed this chapter, in 190, at the end of 191 and then into 192, we had this editor's note that's saying, Canute looks onto a snow-covered Vinland, or something like that. And it implied that we'd be getting a sort of parallel story of Canute starting, or something like that, or at least getting his perspective and seeing how things are going for him. But in reality, it had nothing to do with him looking to Vinland. It was a flashback where he was escorting Thorfinn's ship, and which leads to the whole Vargar backstory. But this one is interesting. So when we talked about last time this was misleading with that Canute preview. Yes, it wasn't exactly what the preview implied, but Canute was still there. So a lot of people will be saying, alright guys, don't get too excited, but if just the fact that Canute will show up is exciting to you, I wouldn't be concerned that he wouldn't show up. Last chapter preview saying Thorfinn would be here. Yes, obviously he was not here, but it's Thorfinn, right? Chances are, if the editor doesn't know what's coming next, they'll at least figure, well, I can mention the main character's name and probably be safe. There's no reason an editor would bring up the word Canute and hype up the name Canute if Canute is not going to be in the chapter. So, yes, obviously, don't get your hopes up too much about what the chapter will be, but Canute will be there. There's no way Canute won't be there, and that would be something else if he was. But okay, let's actually talk about some predictions. So before I get into the Canute stuff, I just want to talk about, I guess, this idea at the end of the chapter that Vinland, what happened in Markland will happen in Vinland, absolutely. We can't exist with the indigenous people. I've been saying for the past, oh my god, since probably the first review. Yeah, it was since the first review I did that Vinland was going to fail. And I am still 100% on board with that idea. I think, one, obviously it's historically accurate, but two, the whole thematic idea of Thousand Year Voyage and the idea of the voyage of these ideas over time to the reader now to carry on, the voyage or whatever. All of that requires Vinland to fail, and I feel like thematically at this point, there's no way it doesn't. So, bold prediction, Vinland's going to fail. I've been saying it every video. But, okay, yeah, enough of that. Let's talk about Canute. So, when I saw that this preview about Canute being in this chapter, I immediately thought back to Planetes. And if you haven't watched my Planetes read through with Jarky Bacon, definitely go watch it, because although that's a long series of videos, I think reading Planetes has given me a much better idea of what I think the final stretch of chapters will be like for Vinland Saga. Now, obviously Planetes isn't directly related to Vinland Saga, but Yukimura has said before that Planetes and Vinland to him are the same story. They're trying to tell the same thing, but he feels like Vinland Saga is a better way for him to get his ideas across. So, not only does Planetes give us an idea of, as a writer, how does Yukimura end a story, it gives a pretty good idea thematically of where we're probably going. Although Planetes did end on a much happier note than I think Vinland will, I think where this really, really stands out to me is how the character Locksmith, Werner Locksmith, was handled at the end of Planetes. Not to get into too many Planetes spoilers here, so I'll remain pretty light, but the character Locksmith is essentially a, I would say, antithesis of the main character, much like how Canute and Thorfinn have this dynamic of being similar yet having this key distinction, and how that parallel story and how they overlap is very important to understanding the message. And the interesting thing about this character Locksmith, though, is that he does not have as much of a presence in the final, 2 volumes. And Planetes is a 4-volume series, right? So the fact that he doesn't have much of a presence in the later chapters is super interesting. And it makes me think of how Canute also has been kind of in the back seat since the end of the farm. And although he's often mentioned and referenced, and we even got the nice flashback about him, he hasn't been a key player in the main plot anymore, because the plot has kind of grown past him. Thorfinn is doing something different. He's doing his own thing, and Canute's not really an important part of that anymore. But Yukimura knows thematically, yes, he's very important, just like Locksmith was in Planetes. And right when you're kind of getting into the last volume of Planetes, you suddenly get this chapter that's just all about him, all about Locksmith, and it's one of my favorite chapters in the whole manga. And the chapter has nothing to do with what's going on in the main story, the main sort of plot line, but it gets you this idea of just what's going on with him. And then this sets up for the final chapter, where Yukimura essentially focused on building up and putting in full display this distinct difference in comparison between Locksmith and the main character, and how their paths have diverged. So I think that this next chapter with Canute is going to be a self-contained one-off, I guess that's the word maybe I would use, where we're just getting some incident with Canute that ties in thematically with what's going on with Thorfinn. I do not think this is at all setting up for something like the farm arc, where Canute and Thorfinn had parallel stories that converged at the end. I definitely think this is to set up thematic parallels and to set up for the conclusion of the story, where these two who have been trying to create their 2 paradises, we want to see both how their ends and their failures to create paradise on Earth have ended up. I feel like what is left of these 2 characters and how their failures compare is just going to be so important to getting the thematic purpose of Thousand Year Voyage and Vinland Saga across. So that's my prediction. Next chapter is just going to be some standalone incident with Canute, and then we'll be right back to the main plot once again. Now, my bold prediction for next chapter, Willibald is coming back, the priest from the prologue. We're going to see him again, and he's going to have a great conversation with Canute. Or we will see him in the final chapter. I have faith. Willibald will be back. That's my big one. I'll see you all next month for that one. Let's see how that goes. But before ending this, I do want to talk a little bit more about what I think the rats will play into with Vinland. Obviously, I've been trying to find out how will Hild's current action go terribly wrong. And I think having a disease suddenly spread amongst the Ulnu tribe, the Gitpi tribe specifically, that she has no idea about, and just have some insane situation she's walking into where people are already dying, and they already have this paranoia from the Sekpekwe. If the rats come into play in Vinland, I think now is the time. I don't think they're going to just play the role in Markland and then not be involved in Vinland, considering Yukimura has given little teases about the rats in the main settlement for a bit now, and we've seen they got into the food supply, right? So it's absolutely going to happen. It is just a matter of time. So I don't think Chekhov's rat has been fully had the trigger pulled yet. So definitely expect to see disease play into whatever is going to happen in Vinland. I made a lot of predictions last time about how is Hild going to move from here. But again, it seems like we're not going to see Hild for a while. So if you want my predictions on Hild and what Hild might do, definitely, if you haven't watched it, check out last video, or at least maybe check out the end of it. And you can get a good idea of what I think she's going to do. But if the rats being brought up now were to mean anything, I would say that Hild has no idea that she is walking into a situation that is much worse than she may have presumed. And that could easily lead to things spiraling out of her control like I expect it to be. But speaking of Hild, though, what is so interesting about Canute being brought back is that her current method is very much in parallel to Canute. She is using force to get what she wants because she is concerned about what is going to happen to the settlement, to the village in Vinland. And she has just gotten so frustrated with Thorfinn's approach that she knows she needs to do something, and she is a person who has built up so much strength since she was hurt, and she knows she can use this strength to ensure the safety of everyone else and ensure peace. That is Canute to a T. Canute is a king who is trying to build peace by using violence, using threats. Now, Canute has become much better since the farm, at least because of Thorfinn's influence, but we saw in the Scariest Man chapter, Canute is still Canute, and we saw, of course, with Baltic Sea War, that whole thing was orchestrated by Canute. He's still making his questionable decisions because he has the bigger goal in mind. Hild is now the same. Sekpekwe is now the same. These are our scariest men and women. So that is kind of the big interesting thing about having Canute back this time, because now we have Hild in place, especially to be sort of a representation of his ideas too, of how violence and force is justified if it means it's going to be in pursuit of something better. So next time, let's see it. Let's see A really great Canute chapter. I hope that's what we're getting. I hope it is a really interesting and intriguing, thematically rich, just one-off chapter for him, just to give us an update on where he's at and draw those parallels to Hild. So that's all I got for this video. You may have been able to tell this one was definitely not as scripted as my usual, just because this is such a short chapter. All my thoughts are pretty condensed already. As much as this brings up, it's not a lot of new stuff to predict with, just beyond what happened in Markland and how does this relate to what will happen in Vinland. So this one's a bit more off the cuff. Don't expect that for the bigger and still dense chapters that we can expect from Yukimura, especially with Canute. So thank you everyone for watching, and I will see you all next month.